Okay. Well, hello. Good morning, folks. Thank you all for tuning in. Some of you, I'm glad actually, obviously everyone who's tuning in has power, so I appreciate that too. And I do, which is wonderful. But welcome, as always. We are here to talk history and drink coffee. I won't pick up my mug, but you're all invited to bring a beverage. Today, sort of, I didn't mean it to be ironic, but we're talking about silence. And I promise I will not be silent for 30 minutes in honor of this silence. But I really want to talk about what it meant that slavery wasn't discussed in the founding period, what those silences mean. But before I plunge into that, I am going to turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who is going to give you quick instructions about how to ask questions after I'm done with my comments.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, and shout out to all my Michigan family. If this is your first time, I always try to recognize my fellow Michiganders. So, and yes, Dave. Yes, this is the Hemmings cabin. Format for today is if this is your first time, we like to keep chat active. So please put anything germane to our conversation today in chat. Always keep it family friendly, lest you get booted from the room. Questions, please put them in the Q&A. We like to have lots of questions at the end. We try to get to as many as we can. Our last promo, which of course is that today is special because it's part of our Equity Summit. Please go to www.nche.net/Equity Summit to check out all of the programming for the rest of the day today. We have a number of really great sessions, incredible folks, LaGarrett King and Kevin Levin and Yohuru, and so lots of people, some folks from the Equal Justice Initiative. So it's going to be fantastic. So please come check us out. And if you like what we do here at National Council of History Education, please become a member and join us for all kinds of things. Last little bit, make sure you come back next week. We're special this week, but this is a weekly thing and we have a lot of fun and we do great stuff. So we have a huge crowd today for the first time in a while. And so we want to make sure to get you all to come back. This is every week at 10 o'clock. And we want to make sure that you enjoy yourselves and learn a little bit every week. So with that, I'm going to hide away and turn it over to Joanne.
Thank you, Matt. And yes, I will repeat what Matt just said. For those of you who are beaming in as part of the summit, we do this History Matters, and so does coffee, every Thursday morning, 10 o'clock Eastern time. And the point of this, we discuss an issue or a document or a person or an event or something from the past that is interesting or exciting or relevant in some way. We talk about how we can pull things from that document and then we twist it around and talk a little bit about what that way of approaching the past can do to help us understand the present. And normally what happens is I speak for about a half hour, then we have question and answer period. So I do encourage you to come. We've talked about all kinds of things. You can find, if you're interested, all of the past conversations. I'm going to remember the address here at nche.net/conversations. I'll even repeat it, nche.net/conversations. We've been doing this for about 3 months, which is kind of amazing. So that's a lot of past sessions. And we've talked about art as politics and propaganda and the press, any number of things, the power of words. So anyway, I encourage you to keep coming. We've built up in those 3 months a real community of people, and we get to have history conversations every Thursday morning in an informal kind of a way. So, okay. So today, as I said at the outset, I want to talk about silence. Initially, when I suggested this and told Matt how I wanted to approach this topic today, I think I titled it Not Talking About Slavery. And the more I thought about it this morning, I realized really what we're talking about is silence. I'm going to come back. I see some questions there about History Matters in the evening. I will come back to that. But so I am going to talk about silences about slavery and what they mean, and the consistency with which this issue is silenced in a very deliberate way, and what those silences mean. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we can and should think about silences generally. Obviously, in the founding period, and in a moment I'm going to be talking about the Constitution, there was a lot of attempt to not confront this issue, to not discuss the issue. When you see what I'm going to lay out here today, the effort and different kinds of effort by different kinds of people to silence this issue, it really is a reminder of a topic that we've addressed in the past, which is the power of words, right? Which sounds like a cliche, but it's more than a cliche. Words have real power. Words fuel action. Words reveal opportunities. Words change realities or show new realities that are possible. You know, words are powerful. In a recent week, I talked about a document that I couldn't find my copy of, but that I discussed anyway, about someone in the late 1850s who wrote to the Speaker of the House and basically asked the Speaker, who is an anti-slavery Northerner, to keep his friends from throwing missiles over to the Southerners in the House, or there would be bloodshed. And by missiles, he meant words, dangerous words. So that's a great example of what I'm talking about today. Now, starting with the Constitution, the most obvious thing, and I'm guessing that most of you out there already know this, is that the words slavery and slave do not appear in the US Constitution, the original US Constitution from the Constitutional Convention. And semi-recently, there was a debate between a number of journals and the press about what that means. And some people argued that because the Constitution didn't promote slavery, it allowed for it to not exist, and thus in some ways is not a pro-slavery document. Others argue that the deliberate silencing of that word and that topic in that blunt a way actually is support, enables it to continue. I fall into that second camp. John Quincy Adams falls into that second camp too. He apparently said when he was arguing the Amistad case about this an insurrection on a slave ship and what should happen to the people on the ship, he described the absence of the words slavery and slave in the Constitution as a fig leaf, covering over a reality that people didn't want to be seen. So silence is a fig leaf. Silence he described as an action. And when you think of it that way, when you think about the many attempts in the Constitution and thereafter to deliberately not discuss slavery, always arguing in one way or another, the Union depends upon it, not discussing it, you can see in a literal kind of a way, and by literal, I actually mean real and words. In a literal kind of a way, the Union repeatedly was grounded on slavery and allowing it to exist by not discussing it, by just taking it out of the picture out of the ongoing debate about whatever was going on, arguing that, oh, that's going to break everything. We'll just put it off to the side. And so the Union repeatedly is saved and reinforced by agreeing to just not discuss slavery. Now let's look for a minute at the Constitutional Convention. Of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention, roughly 25 owned enslaved people. At the convention, there is not an enormous amount of discussion of slavery, but there's some. And some of it goes along the lines of, I suppose, what you might expect. Some people, Northerners, and I think someone from Maryland, raised the question of morality, arguing that it's immoral, bringing up the fact that many people bring up during the period and beyond about, you know, this country supposedly being founded based on, you know, freedom and free will and America not being enslaved to the British. How can we then allow this to be within the Constitution? Southerners responded, and in particular, a South Carolinian. South Carolina is always trouble. A South Carolinian responds by saying, this has nothing to do with morality. That's very nice. We're talking about states, we're talking about economics, we're talking about states' rights in the Constitution, we're talking about any number of other things, but morality shouldn't be part of this picture. So right there, there's two different conversations happening, and one side is refusing really to engage with the other. But if you look at the Constitution, despite the fact that it doesn't explicitly mention slavery or slaves, of course, there are three things that affect slavery. The most noted one, of course, is what comes to be known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is Article 1, Section 2, which basically says that representation and direct taxes will be based on, and this is the language from the Constitution, adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So that's an argument. The Southerners wanted 100% of their enslaved population to count when figuring out representation, because of course that would give the South even more power on a national scale in Congress, more representation. The compromise was, okay, 3/5 of the population of enslaved people will count. Despite the fact that it's knocked down a little bit, that really does give the South a real grip of power on the national government that in later years comes to really be hung on the title slave power. That there's a slave power that's controlling the national government, and in many ways, there was a slave power controlling the national government. That wasn't mere rhetoric, that wasn't mere words, there was some reality to that. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is one obvious thing that is about slavery and doesn't use the word. There's also what ends up being known as the Importation Clause, Article 1, Section 9. And here's the language from the Constitution on that. It says, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. Okay, so that's basically, although it's you know, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. Wow, that's a way of not saying a word. What that really is addressing is the fact that the international slave trade probably is going to be abolished, and the Constitution is giving a 20-year period, a sort of grace period, for states to be able to import slaves before basically the importation of slaves in that way, 1808, will be stopped. By 1809, all the states had abolished the international slave trade. So, you know, that's on the one hand seems sort of anti-slavery, but it isn't, because in stopping the international slave trade, even Southerners were not entirely opposed to that, because then it boosts the value of domestic slaves, right? So again, even that, there's always two sides to be argued, but everyone thinks their side is correct. I really do think that words and silences matter, and this is a case of that as well. They may not say, they may talk about such persons as any of the states think proper to admit. What a euphemism. But what they're doing is saying, okay, the international slave trade is going to stop. We're not going to really interfere with that until 1808. And what will happen is that the domestic slave trade will probably increase in value because of that. Okay, so that's number two. Number three is the Fugitive Slave Clause, Article 4, Section 2. And here's the language of that clause. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So basically, the Fugitive Slave Clause is saying a person held to service or labor, again, wonderful roundabout way of saying this, who goes into another state will not be freed, but should be delivered up to the person who that labor is due to. Again, wonderful euphemism. In 1793, there's a Fugitive Slave Act that offers some teeth for that. And then there's the famous Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 that says that state governments and citizens have to enforce the capture and return of fugitive enslaved people. But again, nowhere in anything that I've said is the word slave or the word slavery mentioned. The amazing euphemisms and the deliberate intention to say what they mean without saying it deliberately is striking. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't opposition. And of course, there were abolitionist groups early on in this period. There are abolitionists who argue in the early Congresses, put their cause forth. And there are some states who abolished slavery very early in this process, actually even in the immediate post-revolutionary period. But overall, aside from people who are dedicated to or activists for abolitionism, there's a lot of murmuring or silence. That is the goal, is silence. And a lot of people thought, and when I was digging around this morning, I should have copied some of these quotes. A lot of people thought it will just disappear. Slavery will just disappear. That's an interesting argument for things that are a big problem that people don't want to address. We just say that it will disappear. So silence is convenient and possible with that assumption. Yeah, I very deliberately didn't say COVID, but yeah. That's what I was thinking of. Now, this actually, before I move on, I was going to move on to the 1820s and the 1830s for a moment, but I do want to raise this. I'm actually going to be, I'm having to, like everyone else, revise the syllabi for my courses so that they can be online appropriate, which is really hard. And one of the things I'm going to be assigning to one of my courses comes from this book, which I want to raise here. It's Richard Newman, The Transformation of American Abolitionism. What's striking about this is that it's pre-1830s. What he's doing in this book is really saying, yeah, everybody talks about what I'm about to talk about, which is the 1820s and the 1830s, and that's when there's a real rise in abolitionist activism. But this book says, yeah, but there's stuff going on before that point. So this is a really useful book for talking about abolitionism and anti-slavery efforts in the early republic, where there's less written. So I hold that up because this is one of the things I was looking at this morning. And I've been looking at it recently because I'm teaching a course called The Creation of the American Politician, which I've taught for 20 years at Yale. And this year, not only do I have to change it to be online, but I think we have to talk in a different way about politicians and what they do and politics and who's included and who isn't included. And so I'm going to have a unit that talks about abolitionist efforts, Black and white abolitionist efforts. Okay, roundabout little tangent there, but let's go back to the 1820s and the 1830s when, as I just suggested, abolitionism really rises. And the real battle in this period, once again, in an even more explicit way than during the convention, becomes silencing talk of slavery or breaking the silence. So, for example, just the two main, or certainly two prominent abolitionist newspapers in this period, William Lloyd Garrison, The Liberator, which starts in 1831. In what I believe is his first issue, he says, as sort of a motto, I will be heard, right? I will be heard. My words will be heard. This will not be silenced. Really strikingly, if you look at Freedom's Journal in New York City, which is the first African-American owned and operated newspaper in the United States, their first edition, 1827, what do they say? For too long others have spoken for us. We are going to speak now for ourselves. This is about being heard on a subject that no one, or certainly the vast majority of people, don't want to be heard regarding. Now look even at, sort of legislative action. Think about the American Anti-Slavery Society really begins to rise in this period that I'm talking about. And one of the things that they try to do, and that they actually do, is create anti-slavery pamphlets and flood the South, flood the mail with these pamphlets to get the word out, to spread ideas, to open possibilities. And ideally, obviously, to get that word out as broadly as they can. So not just to slave owners, but as widely as those pamphlets might be able to be disseminated. And of course, what happens in response to that, massive attempts to stop the pamphlets, to silence the pamphlets. 1836, John C. Calhoun proposes, I wrote prosed, which is kind of fitting, proposed a post office bill in the Senate allowing postmasters to destroy abolitionist publications, right? So, okay, American Anti-Slavery Society, you could just send those pamphlets on down. We're gonna pass a law that enables postmasters to just take them and destroy them, end of story. It fails by a vote of 19 to 25, but again, same thing. We need to get the words to the South. Southerners saying, oh, no, we're gonna silence the words. The most obvious example of this, and we early on, we had a session about this, about the Gag Rule and the attempt to silence talk of slavery and the assumption that somehow if that talk could be silenced, if there would not be discussion of anti-slavery petitions, that would somehow enable things to keep burbling along and that this would stave off a crisis. And as I talked about when we had that discussion, gosh, whenever we started this, however, I'm not even going to try and guess, but way back when we talked about the Gag Rule, one of the interesting things about that moment is that it was passed, a series of resolutions and then a Gag Rule were passed with the assumption that this is a way to stifle dissension. And, you know, the book lurking behind me here, The Field of Blood, is about violence in Congress. One of the things I found when I tracked violence in Congress is that the most violent years in Congress are the late 1850s and the Gag Rule years, because people actually stood up, anti-slavery advocates, abolitionists, stood up and opposed being gagged. So again, over and over and over again, we're talking about broad categories: slavery, anti-slavery, abolitionism, reform, things that are happening in legislatures. I'm reading off to the side too. I'm going to come back actually when we go to the questions, because what's wonderful is I discovered very late in the process that I could look at people, what people were saying in the chat function, and that was dangerous because suddenly I could engage with everybody, which is good, but it means while I'm talking to you, I'm like, yeah, compensation. So yeah, economics and money is a big part of it too. There are so many things feeding into this silence. Ironically, the very thing that is leading to a rise in white suffrage and a rise in white power in the 1820s and 1830s, you have the beginning of real political parties, right? The rise of Jackson really brings structured political parties, which empowers white men of many kinds. In that same period, you have religious revivalism happening and more democratic politicking happen. So the very things that are increasing white power, political power, are also things that are fueling the reform movements that, among other things, are addressing slavery. So anti-slavery activists are fueled by the same energy that's pushing forward white concentration in democratic processes. It's part of the same movement. So that basically, always, in a sense, what we're seeing is a back and forth. The fact that you can't disentangle support of slavery from suppression of talk of slavery, that you can't move those things apart. You can't even talk about the rise of democracy without talking about slavery and opposition to it. And in a sense, this is a cliche, but it's one that we're addressing in earnest now in many ways as a nation. And it's a foundational fact, right? That who we are as a people is a blend of ideals and brass tacks realities, ideals not met, injustices, disservices, There's a blend of things, good and bad, and you cannot understand our history. You cannot understand where we are and why we're here without including all of that in the picture, because it is the picture. Only together does it make sense. I talked weeks ago, whenever I talk about the conflicting views and people silencing things, I always think about the sort of pseudo narrator in the book I recently published. His name is Benjamin Brown French, and he's generally anti-slavery. He's from New Hampshire. He's a clerk in Congress. He's generally anti-slavery, but he doesn't want it addressed or talked about because it's dangerous. And there's this one sentence I include in the book in his diary. So this isn't even him trying to be, swift and spiffy for anybody else. He says something like, I oppose slavery, and I think it ought to be ended, and I think it shouldn't be discussed, and I think it's not a matter for the North to address because it's a Southern problem anyway, and I think we shouldn't discuss it in Congress, but it shouldn't spread to the West. It's like, okay, well, that's nothing in that sentence can happen at the same time. And that's such a great example of the swirl of ideas going on in this period and why there's such ongoing attempts to silence discussion of it. Now, I see I'm running out of time. I bring things back to the present in some way, which I will now do now. I've said many, many, many times, yeah, he wasn't of two minds, he was of like six. Yeah, he was of many minds, but what's wonderful about that quote is the fact that he puts that on paper and then just leaves it there for historians like me, but still, that he somehow allows himself to think all of that at the same time. But to swing things around to the present, I've said many, many times, almost every week, right? We have to watch what's being said. We have to think about the rhetoric that's being thrown at us. We have to think about what we're reading. We have to think about how people might be trying to engage our emotions and our feelings and bypass our reason in the kind of political climate that we're in. And in one way or another, I've said week after week after week, think about words, watch words, read the words, think about what people are saying, and really think about it before you allow yourself to explode with a response, because words matter. Well, this week I'm adding an addendum, and that is heed the silences. Watch for the silences. What isn't addressed can often mean as much, if not more, than what is addressed. Deliberate silencing, censoring, suppression. When you see these things going on, that's a signal, that's a sign, that's a blaring alarm that whatever is being silenced or censored or suppressed is the real heart of not only the problem, but a real source of power. Right? You only need to silence something if there's power inherent in it that you're threatened by. So look for the silences. Look for deliberate silences like the silence over slavery that I've been talking about before this point. Look for things that aren't being addressed that we feel should be addressed. Because if people are deliberately being silent or silencing others about something that is so obviously smack at the center of public debate, public affairs, just the American, not only American experience, but who we are as a nation and how we're faring, silences mean something. They mean people are afraid of something, that they're going to deliberately not talk about it, and they mean that there's some kind of power that they're fighting against, and by silencing whatever they're silencing, they're going to pretend it's not there. So it's another way to stay empowered and think about what's going on at this particular moment. Watch for silences, think about what they mean. And some of the silences we're seeing now have to do with race. Some of the silences have to do with protest. Some of the silences have to do with the virus. There are any number of things, and some of them, we are now engaged in a national debate about our history in some ways. It's a really interesting time to be a historian. But what people do and don't want to say in that debate, and what they don't want other people to say, that really, really matters. Okay, I am almost out of time, and I want to leave people a chance to ask questions. So I am going to stop talking. I always am trying in one way or another. You know, when I first came up with the idea to do this, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to talk about history and how we look at history. And yes, I'm going to be showing you the mug. I just reached for it, but then I remembered I wanted to say this. When I first came up with this idea, I wanted to show how we can look at history in ways that show us something about the present. And I wanted to show how those things can be used in understanding and empowering ourselves in this moment, to understand things better, to read things, to look for things, to watch for things, to speak, right? Silence speaks volumes. To empower us in this moment, both to understand things better as they're coming at us or not coming at us, and to empower us to speak on our own behalf. So that's part of the point of History Matters. It's a blend of engaging with history, which of course I love to do, and I am primary sources make me, or like nirvana for me, but I'm doing that with a goal in mind, and the goal is we are in a moment when so much is contingent, and as a historian, I feel like historians are among the people that can really address the public as well as teachers. I know there are many, many teachers here as well, who can really inform people about ideas that are fundamental to who we are as a nation, and get people talking and debating about things that perhaps aren't being debated about in other ways. Okay, for those of you who are new, because we have a huge crowd here, which is wonderful, every week I began the goofy tradition of using a different mug that represents or connects somehow with the topic of conversation. Somehow, magically, I always ask Matt this, is this number seven? Wait,
18.
18, okay. We've been doing this for 18 weeks, which means I have way too many mugs. However, I ran out. I was crushed about this because I thought, oh no, my tradition. And I managed to go into storage and find one or two extra mugs. And this is the mug that relates to today, and yet what we're talking about is bigger than this mug. This is actually from the first paper I gave in grad school about my work, a conference titled "Telling About the South." Right? That's what it was about, was Southern culture, Southern politics, Southern empowerment. I talked about Southern politics, I think. And I think Thomas Jefferson was in there somewhere. At any rate, telling about the South does indeed relate to today, but of course, a lot of what I'm talking about today is not just the South, and that's part of the point as well. Silence keeps this issue from having a national impact, which is what so many people were basically trying to avoid, and thus, in their mind, save the Union by not discussing something that needed to be discussed. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. And you can never have too many mugs. Well, apparently that is true for me now, that you can never. But 18, like I really felt kind of almost ashamed that I have that many.
I think you only reused a mug one time in the first 18 weeks.
I think that is true. I reused one. That is true. Last week, right?
Last week, yeah.
Yeah, it was the only time.
Yeah. We do have some great questions, and we're a little short on time. We got 10 minutes-ish, so we'll try to do quick questions. I want to start with a question from Seth, who says, these euphemisms you talked about, any such person held to labor, were they common in everyday usage, or were they only used in official documents? In other words, would the general population would they use euphemisms as well in normal conversation?
The general population used euphemism for sure, not necessarily those.
Right.
You know, my family would include enslaved people. My servants would include, so yeah, there were all kinds of euphemisms used. Again, a silence of a different sort. I was talking about sort of high-level silences, but yeah, there were many levels of silence, but the silences in the Constitution explicitly, because they're dealing with, you know, law and rights in one way or another, they're being both more specific and more general at the same time with those euphemisms. But yeah, there were all kinds of ways in which people use euphemisms. I mean, I talked before when talking about the Gag Rule. One of the ways that John Quincy Adams argued on behalf of anti-slavery petitions was not arguing against slavery, but actually saying, by silencing your petitions, Northerners, your right of petition is being violated. And he knew Northerners would get very upset if their rights were being violated, far more than they might get upset about whether slavery was being discussed or not on the floor of Congress. So even that, in a way, is a strategic silence, right? He was like, well, I'm talking about slavery, but what I'm really going to stress here is your rights, your right of representation, your right to petition the government, because that's going to rile people up in a personal way that slavery may not. So, even the good guys are playing with silences, but that's, our nation has always had a silencing, that's how we've dealt with slavery. Silencing, avoiding, not discussing, sweeping aside.
Connected to that, though, Alexa asks, do you think the silence is more present in the white community or connected to privilege or wealth? And so just to kind of reframe her question, I think, is this idea of silence is it something that we find because of the group of people who are avoiding talking about it, in terms of their relative privilege, their power, and things along those lines? Does that?
So is the question that are people using euphemisms because they're afraid to offend people, or is the question as to why people are using euphemisms?
No, the question is, I'll read the question directly, and I may have reframed it wrong. Do you think the silence is more present in the white community? Is this connected to privilege? How is this connected to our founding fathers?
Read one
I
more.
think you answered the last one, but
yeah. Read the beginning one more time so I can get
sure thing. Do you think the silence is more present in the white community? Is this connected to privilege?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, that's why Freedom's Journal, when there's an African-American newspaper that is going to step forward and talk about this, first of all, that's something people notice, but right there is a reflection of the fact that this is not a white problem. It's an American problem. It's a white and black problem. But the words that are getting out are the words of white people who can bank to a certain degree on privilege that allows them to be that person, to speak those words. So yeah, I do think that that's partly a matter of privilege. And I think, people had to step forward and basically put themselves on the line, African-American people, and which they did from the very beginning, but were just, again, sort of pushed off and had to force themselves forward and say, like William Lloyd Garrison, I will be heard. People have been speaking for us for too long. So, I will be heard. It feels like a phrase that somehow we ought to keep, we might need. It's such an empowering phrase in so many ways. Anyway, I'll stop going off on a tangent because I know we're.
This is a question I don't think we have covered yet in 18 links. So it's from an anonymous person, so I can't give credit to anybody. But why did the founders choose 3/5 in the 3/5 clause? It seems like a random fraction. Like, how did they come to 3/5?
I mean, actually, I don't. It's been a really long time since I've read that debate. My assumption, which is a very basic one, is that's basically half plus. Okay. It's going to be either 2 or 3. 4 would seem too many and 1 would seem too little. And so 3 was the compromise that even in the compromise favored the South, but still. But I haven't read that debate in a long time, so there could be a much more detailed,
nuanced version of that. But that's helpful. I thought it was a good question.
Oh, here we go. James Madison established that ratio under the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
Okay, look at that.
Thank you.
We have the best history community here.
We really do. This is Francesca, our longtime friend, wants to know, could the North have fought harder to get slavery eliminated in the Constitution, or was that impossible?
Well, the way people talked about it at the time, when it was raised, it was sort of bluntly asserted by some Southerners that that was the dividing line, right? They would say, well, that if you do that in the Constitution, we're out of the Union. That very well might have been the case. You know, I've talked before, I don't remember what week I talked about it in, but we take a lot for granted when we look at the founding about of courses. And the fact is there are no of courses in that period, really. There are a couple, but as far as would the Union take the shape it did, would it survive? Would we have a constitution? Would we win the revolution? Blah, blah, blah. None of those things could be taken for granted. So, you know, might the Southerners have left? Sure, they might have. I don't think, so I think the people at the time assumed, which is part of their justification for just not talking about it. Oh, well, that is just the Union, so we can't talk about it. You know, that there's a spectrum, and one end of the spectrum is we will ignore it and silence it and won't talk about it. The other end of the spectrum is we will take active action, and there's a lot of gray area in between that could have been taken that wasn't necessarily taken. But I don't think, it's hard to see Southerners just saying, okay, we can end slavery now, if you consider everything that Southerners did for the next couple of decades to prevent that very thing from happening.
So as a side note, Joanne and I were talking about this before, where it's very strange to have a short episode today, because we're used to sort of these long conversations. But we only have time for one more question, unfortunately, with everything. And so this is again from an anonymous attendee, and I apologize, I can't give credit.
Before you ask the question, though, and before people start to go away, or if they go away, let me say that I think the next panel that's up at 11 is Black Founding Fathers?
Yes, LeGarrette King.
Sounds amazing. So nice little segue there, which I was hoping this would do. But anyway, go on.
Yes, and again, if you haven't seen LeGarrette, he is a terrific speaker, and a great educator as well. So here's this hopefully will set us up for our next panel, or our next conversation with Dr. King, which is, are there any examples of enslaved or free Blacks that spoke for or against the Constitution? And then are there any primary sources you're aware of that could help demonstrate that?
Well, as far as primary sources during the debate over the Constitution, I want to say yes, but I'm not going to be able to put my finger on it without digging around. Mm-hmm. There were all kinds of ways in which African-American people found ways to voice their feelings. I mean, there was Phyllis Wheatley and poetry. There was Benjamin Banneker writing to Jefferson. You know, there were any number of ways in which people were stepping forward in writing, again, to be heard, to get their words out there for people to hear them. But I'd have to look actually, that's something that I can indeed look and address and bring back next week. It's hard for me to believe that that wasn't the case, since it was so obviously a document that did and didn't have potential in it, that did and didn't seem to allow for opportunity. That's what some of our actually, yeah, anti-slavery writing, I was going to come back to that. You know, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, those are documents that you can ground an assertion of rights on. And people who were denied those rights made very savvy use of those documents for that purpose. There is indeed, I have it sitting over here, there's a collection of anti-slavery writings by Jim Basker, which I think is titled Anti-Slavery Writings. I have not looked at it. Actually, I was going to look at it because it might get deployed in the class I'm still working on the syllabus for, but that would be an excellent place to start. Okay, I am going to stop talking. I wish we could go on, but I'm actually eager to hear the next panel too. I encourage all of you who are here to please join us next Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. I partly base the topic normally grounded on what happens in the news to make this relevant, in addition to finding things that I just I'm passionate about talking about. So I don't know yet. I probably won't figure it out until after the next couple of days what the topic will be. But as always, please come, bring your beverage of choice. I just need to be caffeinated in the mornings. And we will continue. I love our community here. I say that almost every week. I will say it again because it's bigger this week. And I wish all of you a great week. And I encourage all of you to tune in for so many of these great NCHE panels that are going to continue today. It's a great thing. And I will say, Matt, I will throw this out there. Maybe there should be a summit about democracy.
Hey, that's not a bad one. We should talk about that.
I would love to take part in a summit about democracy. It would be pretty important. So anyway, I'll shut up now, and will sign off. And yes, yay democracy is right. The fact that we have to say that makes me want to stab myself. Of course, yay democracy. Okay. Anyway, signing off. Thank you all for coming, and I will see you next week.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll look forward to having a great week next week.